I secretly owned 45% of my father-in-law's company. My husband had no idea. To him, I was just the woman who lived off his family. The night he called me a freeloader in front of his parents, my mother-in-law slid an envelope across the dinner table. Inside were 2 documents. One meant I could stay in the family. The other meant I would disappear from it forever. What none of them knew was that the company they were trying to protect from me was already partly mine. My name is Emily Carter, and for almost 4 years of my marriage, my husband Daniel believed something about me that wasn't true. He believed I had nothing, no wealth, no influence, no real value beyond the last name I took when I married him. To Daniel, I was the quiet wife who stayed home. The one who, in his words, lived comfortably because of the Caldwell family. But the truth was a little more complicated than that. The Caldwell family owned Caldwell Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial equipment company based outside Columbus, Ohio. It had been around for more than 30 years and employed nearly 400 people across 2 facilities. Daniel liked to talk about it as if his father had built it from the ground up alone. Everything we have, he would say, came from my dad's hard work. I never corrected him. At first, it didn't seem necessary. When Daniel and I met in college, he was charming in that easy, confident way some men carry themselves when they've never had to doubt their place in the world. He studied business. I studied finance. He liked that I was calm, thoughtful, practical. He used to say I grounded him. Back then, he never called me a freeloader. That word came later. After the wedding, after I left my job, after I quietly stepped back from a career I loved, so Daniel could focus on climbing the ladder inside his father's company. At the time, it felt like a reasonable trade. Marriage meant partnership, didn't it? I handled the finances at home. I helped him analyze proposals. Sometimes he even asked my opinion on deals the company was considering. In private, Daniel admitted I had good instincts. But in front of his family, the story changed. At family dinners, he'd joke, "Emily gets to relax all day." His mother, Margaret, would smile politely. His father, Frank, would nod without really listening. And I would sit there calm, composed, letting the moment pass. Because I knew something they didn't. Something that made their assumptions strangely harmless. Until the night everything changed. It was a Friday evening in early October when Daniel told me we were having dinner with his parents. "Dad wants to talk about some changes at the company," he said while tying his tie in the mirror. "Probably promotions." He glanced at me. "You don't mind, right?" I shook my head. "Of course not." The restaurant they chose was a private country club outside the city, the kind of place where the waiters remembered your name, and the lighting was soft enough to make every conversation feel important. Margaret Caldwell was already seated when we arrived. She wore a dark blue blazer and pearl earrings, her posture as perfect as always. Frank sat beside her, scrolling through something on his phone. Daniel kissed his mother's cheek. "Sorry we're late." Margaret's eyes moved to me. Her smile was thin. "Emily." "Margaret." Dinner started pleasantly enough. Small talk, business updates. A story Frank told about a supplier problem at the factory. Then halfway through the main course, Margaret set down her wine glass. Her expression changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. She folded her hands neatly on the table. "In this family," she said calmly, "everyone contributes." The words hung in the air. I knew immediately the conversation wasn't about business. Daniel shifted in his chair. Margaret looked directly at me. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about fairness." Frank glanced up, mildly curious, but clearly unaware of where this was going. Margaret reached into her purse. When her hand came out, she was holding a white envelope. She placed it on the table. Then she slid it slowly across the polished wood surface until it stopped in front of me. "You have 2 options," she said. Daniel didn't look surprised, which meant he already knew. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 sets of documents. The first was a legal agreement. A waiver. It stated that if I chose to remain married to Daniel, I would permanently give up any future claim to the Caldwell family inheritance or assets. That included the company. The second document was simpler. Divorce papers. Already filled out. Margaret's voice was calm. If you want to remain part of this family, she said, sign the first one. Her fingers folded neatly again. If not, sign the second. I slowly looked up. Daniel avoided my eyes. Frank leaned forward slightly, reading the documents. His eyebrows lifted in mild confusion. Margaret continued. We believe this is the most practical solution. She paused. You've lived comfortably for several years now. It's only fair we protect what belongs to the Caldwell family. The word fair echoed strangely in my mind. I turned another page. Legal language. Cold and precise. My signature line waited quietly at the bottom. Margaret watched me carefully. You understand, she said, this isn't personal. Daniel finally spoke. It's just business, Emily. Just business. I closed the folder slowly. Then I placed both documents back inside the envelope. For a moment, no one said anything. Margaret studied my face, searching for something, anger maybe. But I felt none. Just a quiet clarity. Because sitting there in that expensive restaurant, listening to them discuss my place in the family as if I were an employee being evaluated, I realized something. They believed I had nothing to lose. They believed the Caldwell fortune was entirely theirs. And they believed I was simply a woman living off their generosity. I slid the envelope gently back across the table. Right to Margaret. I'll need some time, I said calmly. Margaret nodded, satisfied. Of course. Daniel exhaled, quietly relieved. Frank returned to his phone, the matter apparently settled in his mind. Dinner resumed. But inside my head, something had shifted. Because as I sat there listening to them talk about quarterly earnings and expansion plans, I couldn't stop thinking about a name they had just mentioned without understanding its meaning. A name printed quietly on the company's shareholder records. A name they assumed belonged to someone else. Carter Family Trust. What they didn't know was that I was the only person in the room who truly understood what that name meant. And by the time they discovered the truth, the conversation about who belonged in the Caldwell family would sound very different. When I got home that night, I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long time without opening it again. The house was quiet. Daniel had gone upstairs to shower, humming to himself, like a man relieved that an uncomfortable conversation had been handled. To him, the dinner had gone exactly as expected. His mother had presented a practical solution. I had taken the documents. Soon, I would sign one of them. Problem solved. From Daniel's perspective, the world was simple. From mine, it had just become very clear. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of me under the soft yellow light. I slid the documents out again. The waiver agreement was written by a very competent attorney. Whoever Margaret had hired understood exactly what they were doing. The language was airtight. If I signed it, I would give up any claim to the Caldwell family inheritance and assets, present and future. That included any shares, trusts, or holdings connected to the Caldwell estate. In other words, I would legally confirm what they already believed. That I had no place in their wealth. I smiled faintly. Not because the document was cruel, but because of the quiet irony it carried. Margaret Caldwell had spent weeks preparing a legal shield to protect the Caldwell fortune from me. The problem was that she had never realized something important. The Caldwell fortune was never entirely hers to protect. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting my thoughts drift to a time long before I met Daniel. Before Ohio. Before Caldwell Manufacturing. Before the dinner table where my worth had just been measured like an entry on a balance sheet. 26 years earlier, my mother had stood in a small office across from a man named Frank Caldwell. Back then, Frank wasn't the confident CEO who ran a thriving industrial company. He was a mechanic with an idea. A good one, as it turned out, but ideas need money. My mother had it. Her name was Laura Carter. She had inherited a modest investment portfolio from my grandfather, who had spent his life building small manufacturing businesses across the Midwest. She wasn't reckless with money. She was careful, analytical, patient. When Frank Caldwell approached her about funding a new industrial equipment company, she didn't say yes immediately. She asked questions. She studied the projections. She visited the workshop where Frank and 2 other engineers were building their first prototype. 3 weeks later, she agreed to invest. In exchange, she received 45% ownership in the company that would eventually become Caldwell Manufacturing. Frank kept majority control of operations, but the company had 2 financial foundations: Frank's labor and my mother's capital. For nearly 10 years, the partnership worked well. The business grew steadily. But my mother never wanted to run a factory. She preferred investments that could be monitored quietly from a distance. So when the company stabilized, she stepped back from day-to-day involvement and allowed Frank to run the operation entirely. On paper, her ownership remained the same, 45%. Then when I was 17, everything changed. My mother died unexpectedly from a stroke. She was 48. In the months that followed, lawyers handled the legal details. Her shares in Caldwell Manufacturing were transferred into a legal entity called the Carter Family Trust. The trust had one beneficiary, me, but my mother had designed it carefully. The trust didn't publicly list my name in corporate records. Instead, the shares remained under the trust's legal identity, managed by an attorney, until I reached 30. It was a simple structure, one used by wealthy families all over the country. Quiet, private, protective. Frank Caldwell knew the trust existed. But after my mother's death, we barely spoke again. He assumed the trust would remain passive, an early investor's quiet shadow. And over time, he seemed to forget it entirely. Years later, when I met Daniel in college, I never mentioned the trust. At first, it simply didn't seem relevant. Daniel fell in love with the version of me he saw, a practical finance student who liked quiet coffee shops and long walks across campus. I fell in love with the version of him who laughed easily and dreamed big. Money wasn't part of those conversations. And by the time Daniel eventually joined Caldwell Manufacturing after graduation, the trust still sat quietly in the background. Its ownership unchanged. Its power unnoticed. Daniel never asked who owned the other shares of the company. Why would he? In his mind, Caldwell Manufacturing belonged to his family. By the time we married, he believed the company's success was the natural result of his father's hard work. My role in the story didn't exist. And for a long time, I allowed it to stay that way. Not because I was hiding something malicious, but because I wanted a normal marriage. I wanted to be Emily, not the woman who owned half the company. But marriages change. Success changes people. Daniel began climbing the corporate ladder inside Caldwell Manufacturing. Promotions came quickly. Confidence followed. Then arrogance. And somewhere along the way, Daniel rewrote the story in his head. The company became his father's legacy. The house we lived in became a Caldwell family gift. And I slowly became something else in his narrative. Someone who benefited from their success without contributing. A freeloader. Upstairs, I heard the shower turn off. Water pipes rattled briefly behind the walls. Daniel's footsteps moved across the bedroom floor. Soon, he would come downstairs. Probably to ask if I had signed the waiver yet. I placed the documents neatly back into the envelope. Then I stood up and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the living room. Inside the drawer was a leather folder. I opened it. Inside were documents that looked far older than the ones Margaret had handed me tonight. Stock certificates, trust agreements, legal letters bearing the name Carter Family Trust. 45% ownership. Still active. Still valid. Still quietly recorded inside the corporate structure of Caldwell Manufacturing. I ran my fingers over the paper. Then I picked up my phone. There was only one call I needed to make. The number belonged to a man named Jonathan Hale, the attorney who had managed the trust since my mother's death. He answered on the second ring. "Emily," he said warmly, "it's been a while." "Yes," I replied calmly. Then I glanced again at the envelope on the table. "I think it's time the company held a shareholder meeting." There was a pause on the other end. Jonathan understood immediately. I'll arrange it, he said. I hung up. Upstairs, Daniel's footsteps moved toward the stairs. By tomorrow morning, the Caldwell family would still believe they were protecting their company from me. But very soon, they were going to discover something they had never bothered to ask. The next morning, Daniel left for work before I did. He stood in the kitchen finishing his coffee, scrolling through emails on his phone, completely unaware that anything significant had changed overnight. Did you look at the documents? He asked casually. Yes, I said. And I'm thinking about it. Daniel nodded, satisfied. That's good. It's really just a formality. He put the mug in the sink. You know how my mom is. She just wants everything clear. Everything clear. The phrase lingered in the air for a moment. Then he grabbed his keys and kissed the side of my head. Don't stress about it too much, he added. Just sign the first one and it's done. The door closed behind him. I stood in the quiet kitchen for a few seconds, listening to his car pull away down the driveway. Then I picked up my own phone. At exactly 9:10 that morning, Jonathan Hale called back. It's arranged, he said. That was fast. Well, he replied calmly, when a shareholder with 45% ownership requests an emergency board meeting, companies tend to move quickly. I smiled faintly. When? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. I thanked him and hung up. Across town, Caldwell Manufacturing continued its normal rhythm. The company headquarters sat on the edge of an industrial park outside Columbus. A square brick building surrounded by warehouses, loading docks, and the constant low hum of machines. Daniel loved the place. To him, it represented everything his family had built. What he never realized was that I had been there long before he ever walked through its doors. Not physically, but financially. By the time Daniel arrived at the office that morning, the notification had already been sent. A formal legal request from the Carter Family Trust. Mandatory board meeting. Attendance required. Daniel didn't call me about it, which meant he probably assumed it had something to do with one of the company's outside investors. Frank Caldwell, however, understood the name immediately. The Carter Family Trust had been on the shareholder list since the earliest days of the company. But it had always been quiet. Passive. A sleeping partner? Frank had likely spent decades assuming that trust would never become active again. That assumption was about to change. The next morning, I woke early. I dressed carefully. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy. Just a charcoal gray blazer, a white blouse, and black slacks. Professional. Calm. Controlled. Daniel noticed when I came downstairs. He looked up from the kitchen table, confused. You going somewhere? Yes. Where? I picked up my bag. The office. He frowned. What office? I smiled slightly. You'll see. The drive to Caldwell Manufacturing took about 25 minutes. The building looked the same as it always had. Red brick. Steel-framed windows, company logo mounted above the entrance. Employees moved through the parking lot carrying coffee cups and toolboxes, starting their day like any other Tuesday. But inside the executive conference room on the second floor, something unusual was happening. Frank Caldwell sat at the head of the long walnut table. 3 senior executives sat nearby. Daniel stood beside the window, arms crossed. Margaret had arrived as well, though technically she wasn't part of the company's board. She preferred to be present for important family matters. The mood in the room was tense. Everyone had received the same message. Emergency meeting requested by the Carter Family Trust. Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That trust hasn't contacted us in years, one executive said. Daniel shrugged. Probably some paperwork issue? Margaret looked irritated. Whatever it is, let's get it over with. At exactly 10 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Jonathan Hale walked in first. Tall, composed, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Frank recognized him immediately. Jonathan, he said. Didn't expect to see you. Jonathan nodded politely. Good morning, Frank. He set his briefcase on the table. Then he turned toward the door. Before we begin, he said calmly, I'd like to introduce the beneficiary of the Carter Family Trust. Daniel frowned slightly. Margaret leaned forward. Frank's expression tightened. And then I walked into the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Daniel's confusion was immediate. Emily. Margaret blinked, clearly unsure what she was looking at. Frank stared at Jonathan. What is this? Jonathan opened his briefcase and removed several documents. The Carter Family Trust, he said, currently holds 45% ownership in Caldwell Manufacturing. Frank nodded slowly. Yes, we're aware. Jonathan placed the documents on the table. The sole beneficiary of that trust is Emily Carter. The room went completely silent. Daniel laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. Okay, he said. What kind of joke is this? Jonathan slid the documents toward Frank. Frank picked them up. His eyes moved across the page. Slowly, carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. Daniel stepped closer. What's going on? Frank didn't answer immediately. He looked at me instead. And for the first time since I had known him, the confident certainty in his face had disappeared. You're Laura's daughter, he said quietly. Yes. Margaret looked between us, confused. What does that mean? Frank exhaled slowly. It means, he said, she owns the Carter shares. Daniel stared at me. That's impossible. I set the envelope from the restaurant on the table. The same one Margaret had handed me the night before. Inside were still the two documents she had offered me. The waiver and the divorce papers. I slid the envelope toward them. Last night, I said calmly, you asked me to give up any future claim to the Caldwell family fortune. Margaret's face turned pale. Daniel looked at the envelope, then back at me. But this company exists partly because of my family. Frank remained silent. And Daniel, for the first time in our marriage, looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. For a long moment after my words settled into the room, no one spoke. The silence had a different texture than the one at the restaurant the night before. That silence had been filled with quiet superiority. This one carried something else. Calculation? Frank Caldwell placed the documents slowly back on the table. He had built Caldwell Manufacturing from a workshop into a respected industrial supplier. Men like Frank understood numbers instinctively. And right now, the numbers had changed. 45%. It wasn't just a large stake. It was power. Daniel looked from me to his father. Dad, say something. Frank leaned back in his chair. What exactly do you want from this meeting, Emily? It was a fair question. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Nothing unreasonable. Margaret finally spoke. Her voice was sharp now. You deceived this family. I met her gaze without raising my voice. Number. I never lied. Daniel laughed bitterly. You hid the fact that you own half the company. I own 45%, I corrected gently. Jonathan Hale cleared his throat. For clarity, the Carter Family Trust has held that ownership stake for 26 years. Margaret turned toward Frank. You knew about this. Frank nodded slowly. I knew Laura Carter invested in the company. His eyes moved back to me. But I didn't realize the trust belonged to her daughter. The room settled again. Daniel paced once beside the window. So what now, he said. Are you here to take control? The question hung in the air. I considered it carefully before answering. Number. Frank's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then why call the meeting? Because revenge, when done well, isn't loud. It isn't chaos. It's clarity. I called this meeting, I said, because the company deserves better leadership. Daniel scoffed. You don't even work here. I ignored him. Instead, I turned to the other executives in the room, men who had spent decades managing operations, engineering, and logistics. Caldwell Manufacturing is profitable, I continued. But the margins have been shrinking for 3 years. One of the executives shifted in his chair. Frank watched me closely. Labor turnover has increased 12% since last year, I said. And 2 of your biggest suppliers have raised prices because of delayed payments. Daniel frowned. How do you know that? I smiled slightly. Because I've been reviewing the financial reports. Frank leaned forward now, interest replacing surprise. And your solution? I slid a folder across the table. Inside were several pages of analysis. Restructure purchasing contracts, I said. Improve employee retention by adjusting wages in the manufacturing division. And appoint a new operations manager. Daniel froze. Frank opened the folder and began reading. Margaret's voice cut through the room. This is ridiculous. You walk in here pretending to be a shareholder, and suddenly you're giving orders. Jonathan Hale spoke calmly. She isn't pretending. Margaret glared at him. Frank raised a hand slightly. Let her finish. I continued. The company has strong potential, but leadership decisions over the past 2 years have weakened that position. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're talking about me. Yes. The word landed with quiet precision. Frank closed the folder slowly. You're suggesting Daniel step down. I'm suggesting Daniel gain experience somewhere other than a position he was given because of his last name. Daniel slammed his hand lightly against the table. You think you can walk in here and humiliate me? I looked at him calmly. You humiliated me first. The room went still again. Frank studied both of us. He was a businessman before anything else. What happens, he said carefully, if the board doesn't agree? Jonathan Hale answered that question. With 45% voting power, he said Emily Carter has significant influence on board decisions. Frank understood the implication immediately. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair. You're not trying to destroy the company. Number. You're trying to fix it. Yes. Frank nodded once. I can respect that. Daniel stared at him. You're taking her side. I'm taking the company's side. Margaret looked furious. This is absurd. Frank ignored her. He turned toward the executives. Gentlemen, I think it's time we discuss restructuring. The meeting lasted another hour. By the time it ended, several decisions had been made. Daniel would step down from his current management role. He would begin a 1-year leadership training program under an external consultant. Operational authority would shift to a more experienced manager. And I would take an official advisory position within the company. Not CEO. Not owner. Just what I had always been. A shareholder who cared about the company's future. When the meeting finally ended, the executives filed quietly out of the room. Frank lingered behind. He approached me slowly. I owe your mother more credit than I gave her, he said. She believed in you. He nodded. I see that now. Across the room, Daniel stood rigid beside the window. Margaret whispered angrily to him. Frank glanced at them both. Then he turned back to me. You handled this better than most people would. I wasn't here to burn anything down. He gave a small, thoughtful smile. That's why the company might survive this. As I gathered my papers, Daniel finally spoke. You enjoyed that. I looked at him. Number. I didn't enjoy it. But I wasn't going to keep pretending I was nothing. Daniel didn't reply. And for the first time since we met in college, he seemed unsure of where he stood. A year changes people. Sometimes slowly. Sometimes all at once. For Caldwell Manufacturing, the change was steady and visible. Under the new operational structure, the company stabilized faster than anyone expected. Supply contracts were renegotiated. Employee turnover dropped after wages in the manufacturing division were adjusted. The factory floor, once tense and understaffed, began running with quiet efficiency again. None of those improvements happened overnight. But they happened. And in business, results are the only language that truly matters. Frank Caldwell officially retired 8 months after the board meeting. At 68, he had spent most of his adult life inside the company's walls. Retirement didn't come easily to him, but the decision was practical. The company needed leadership that could adapt to a changing market. He asked me to take the position of chairwoman of the board. Not because of revenge. Not because of the shares. Because, as he said during the final meeting before stepping down, you understand this company in a way the rest of us stopped trying to. It was the closest thing to an apology Frank Caldwell was capable of offering. I accepted the position. Quietly. Without ceremony. Because titles never mattered to me as much as responsibility. And responsibility was something Caldwell Manufacturing now carried together with a board that actually listened to one another. Daniel, meanwhile, spent most of that year learning something far more difficult than corporate strategy: humility. At first, he fought the decision to step down from his role. He blamed his father. He blamed the board. He blamed me. But time has a way of wearing down anger when reality refuses to cooperate. The leadership training program Frank insisted on placing him in was run by a consulting firm in Chicago. For months, Daniel worked under managers who had no idea who his father was, or who I was. To them, he was simply another executive who needed to learn how to manage people without relying on a family name. And slowly, reluctantly, Daniel began to change. He listened more. He spoke less. The arrogance that had once filled every conversation gradually softened into something quieter, something closer to self-awareness. We didn't talk much during that year. Our marriage existed in a strange in-between space, not broken, but not entirely healed either. Then one evening, almost exactly 12 months after the dinner where Margaret slid the envelope across the table, Daniel came home earlier than usual. I was sitting on the back porch reviewing a report from the company's logistics division when he stepped outside. He stood there for a moment watching the sun settle behind the trees. Then he spoke. I was wrong. The words came simply, without defensiveness, without excuses. I closed the folder on my lap. I know. Daniel sat down in the chair beside me. I spent years believing I understood everything about our lives, he continued quietly. About the company, about success. He shook his head slightly. And I never once asked the most obvious question, which was, who you really were. The honesty in his voice was unfamiliar. Not dramatic. Just real. I judged you because I thought you had nothing, he said. I nodded slowly. That's the mistake many people make. Daniel exhaled. I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I know. He looked at the yard, thoughtful. But I'm trying to become someone who deserves it. That was the first real step forward we had taken in a long time. Across town, Margaret Caldwell was learning her own lessons. At first, she had refused to speak to me entirely. The idea that the woman she had once called a freeloader now chaired the company board was not an easy adjustment. But time works on pride the same way it works on anger. Slowly. Relentlessly. One afternoon, nearly a year and a half after the board meeting, Margaret invited me to lunch. We met at the same country club where she had once slid that envelope across the table. The symmetry was not lost on either of us. She sat across from me, her posture still perfect. But her voice had softened. I underestimated you, she said plainly. It wasn't a dramatic apology. Margaret Caldwell had never been a dramatic person. But it was honest. And honesty was enough. I think I replied gently, you underestimated what people are capable of when they're given respect. Margaret studied me for a moment. Then she nodded. The tension between us never fully disappeared. But something else replaced it. Recognition. Understanding. The world continued moving forward. Caldwell Manufacturing grew stronger. Daniel returned from his training program and eventually rejoined the company in a smaller role, one he had earned rather than inherited. And I continued guiding the board, making decisions not out of revenge, but out of responsibility. Because the truth is something I learned long before that dinner ever happened. Money does not reveal who people are. It only exposes what was already there. The night Margaret tried to prove I was a freeloader was the night the Caldwell family finally discovered who truly belonged at the table. A gentle thought before you go. Sometimes the people we underestimate carry the quiet strength that changes everything. If this story made you think, reflect, or remember someone in your own life who proved others wrong, feel free to share it with them. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories like this, stories about dignity, justice, and quiet strength, consider following along for more.